It was supposed to be a quiet check-in, just another luxury suite at the Park Hyatt in Manhattan. But when federal agents knocked on that hotel door in the early hours of May 16th, they weren't there to deliver room service. They came to arrest Sean Diddy Combs. And what they found behind that door, it wasn't just a man getting ready to surrender. It was something else entirely. Inside the room, agents discovered multiple bags of baby oil, bottles of Astroglide, a prescription bottle filled with pink powder, a lab-tested mix of MDMA, cocaine, and possibly GHB, the name on the bottle. Frank Black, an alias Diddy allegedly used to book hotels for private encounters. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd expect someone to keep in their room while negotiating their own arrest. But for prosecutors, it wasn't just strange. It was a clue, a thread that might tie together years of rumors, lawsuits, and whisper. Networks. Because what's unfolding now in a New York courtroom is far more than a celebrity scandal. This is a federal investigation into trafficking, coercion, and abuse with testimonies that are raw, conflicting, and deeply disturbing. At the center is Cassie Ventura, once Diddy's girlfriend, now the prosecution's star witness. Her claims range from emotional manipulation to violent assault, from secret recordings to what she calls freak-offs. Sex parties she says she was forced to participate in, often under the influence of drugs. And while some of her testimony shook the courtroom, other parts have started to crack. The defense says this is all about regret and money. The prosecution says it's about control and decades of it. And stuck in the middle is a jury that's hearing everything for the first time. Is this a case of mutual chaos or calculated abuse? Was Cassie a willing partner in a toxic relationship or a victim trapped behind fame and fear? The truth is probably messier than either side wants to admit. But one thing is clear, this trial is just getting started, and what's already come out is enough to change how people see Diddy. Forever. Cassie's time on the stand was always going to be the emotional centerpiece of the trial. For prosecutors, she wasn't just a witness, she was living proof of the story they're trying to tell. That behind the money, the fame, and the glossy headlines, Sean Combs built a world where fear, control, and sex collided under his rules. But as powerful as her initial testimony was, the courtroom shifted when the defense got their turn. Cassie sat through hours of cross-examination. The defense, led by Anna Estabio, didn't try to deny everything. Instead, they did something much more subtle. They tried to unravel her story, thread by thread. Not with a knockout punch, but with a slow, deliberate strategy. Expose contradictions, challenge her memory, and chip away at her image as a reliable narrator. They focused on dates she got wrong, messages that didn't align with the timeline she described, statements to federal agents that didn't quite match up with what she was saying now in front of the jury. But it wasn't just about facts, it was about tone. Cassie had testified about horrific moments, violence, trauma, manipulation. Yet after some of those events, the defense showed she continued to text Diddy. Some messages were casual. Others were even affectionate. In one exchange, she wrote, "Wish we could have freaked off before you left." In another, "I love our freak-offs when we both wanted." That last part, "when we both wanted," became a focal point. To the defense, it showed that Cassie wasn't forced into anything, that she participated willingly. That maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the story of a victim, but of a partner in a relationship that was toxic, yes, but mutual. But prosecutors pushed back hard. They pointed out that trauma doesn't follow clean logic, that victims often stay close to abusers, that Cassie had said many times she was afraid to say no, and that her words, even the seemingly consensual ones, were often written under emotional pressure, trying to avoid Diddy's temper, trying to survive. Still, there was no denying the complexity. Her testimony wasn't a straight line. It was full of jagged edges, the kind that made people in the courtroom uncomfortable, and that's exactly where doubt can grow. By the time Cassie stepped down, one thing was clear. She had delivered more than just her story. She had also handed the jury a puzzle. The question now, who's putting the pieces together? And what kind of picture are they seeing? In trials like this, words matter. Not just what's said in the courtroom, but what was written in private, years before anyone imagined these messages would end up projected in front of a jury. The defense came prepared with dozens of them. They didn't need Cassie to admit anything outright. All they had to do was show the jury a pattern, or at least the suggestion of one. And that started with the messages, short, direct, and sometimes shockingly casual. One message read, "We should freak off tonight." Another said, "I miss our freak-offs. I love when we both want it." To the defense, these texts were gold. They read them out loud, letting the jury hear Cassie's own words. Then they let the silence hang in the air. No need to over-explain. The implication was clear. If Cassie was texting about sex parties in affectionate, even playful ways, how could she now say she was coerced? They also leaned into the timeline. These weren't texts from the beginning of their relationship. Some were from 2013, others from years later. And yet, Cassie now describes the entire relationship as traumatic, start to finish. But there's a problem with using text as evidence of someone's emotional state. Because anyone who's been in a bad relationship knows the way you talk to someone on the outside doesn't always match how you feel on the inside. Cassie addressed that directly. She told the court she used certain language to keep the peace, that Diddy wanted her to be sexually available all the time, and that if she didn't feed that expectation, she feared the consequences, emotionally, physically, financially. The prosecution argued that this wasn't flirtation. It was survival. Still, the text left a mark. Even for those who believed Cassie, the tone of those messages felt jarring. Not because they contradicted everything, but because they reminded everyone that relationships like this are complicated. Victims don't always sound like victims, and abusers don't always look like villains. And that, in many ways, is what makes this trial so difficult. It's not about who said what, it's about why they said it, and whether the jury is willing to believe that what looks like consent sometimes isn't. If there's one moment that left the courtroom visibly unsettled, it was this one. Cassie had just described one of the most violent and disturbing nights of her relationship with Diddy. The alleged assault that happened after their so-called closure dinner in Malibu sometime after their 2018 breakup. According to her testimony, Diddy dropped her off at home. She thought he was gone, but he came back, forced his way in. She says he threw her to the ground and assaulted her. Her words, "His eyes went black." She said she was terrified, frozen, and that what happened next wasn't just violent. It was haunting. But here's where things got messy. The very next day, and in the days that followed, Cassie not only texted with Diddy, she also slept with him. And during one of those encounters, something unexpected happened. Her phone lit up. It was a FaceTime call from Alex Fine, the man who would eventually become her husband. At the time, he was just her trainer, someone Diddy himself had hired. The courtroom froze as she explained this part. The defense attorney leaned in. "Did Alex know what happened?" she was asked. Cassie said she told him later, but not then, not in the moment. The defense seized on this. If she had just been assaulted, why was she still sleeping with Diddy? Why did she take the call mid-encounter? Why didn't she cut all ties right then? Prosecutors didn't flinch, because this is a pattern that psychologists know all too well, one that often shows up in cases of abuse. It's called trauma bonding. The idea that victims can remain emotionally attached to their abusers even after the worst moments, out of fear, out of shame, out of confusion, or because for years that person had total control over your life. Still, it was hard to ignore how strange it sounded on paper. To some jurors, it may have felt inconsistent. To others, it felt tragically familiar, the kind of thing that only makes sense if you've lived through it. But one thing was clear: the line between victim and partner, love and fear, was not just blurry, it was tangled. And the defense knew that every time Cassie described an awful moment followed by affection, it gave them more room to argue. Maybe this wasn't trafficking. Maybe this was a toxic relationship between two adults. Not a crime, but prosecutors were about to show that there was more than just emotion at play. Because what happened between them didn't always stay behind closed doors. The defense had a strategy, and part of it was personal. They wanted to paint Cassie not just as inconsistent, but as someone who wasn't exactly faithful either. If they could show that she was involved with other high-profile men, maybe they could chip away at the image of a vulnerable, isolated victim. So they started naming names. Chris Brown, Kid Cudi, Michael B. Jordan, even a mysterious NFL player whose identity to this day hasn't been confirmed. Cassie didn't deny the relationships, but she clarified the timing. These were brief flings, she said, and they happened while she and Diddy were on a break. And while that phrase has been debated in every relationship drama since Friends, What mattered in court was the emotional context. Because Cassie says that while Diddy was openly seeing other women, often flaunting them, he couldn't handle the idea of her being with another man, especially if that man was famous. Regular guys? Escorts during the freak-offs? He didn't care, but a celebrity? That set him off. According to Cassie, Diddy would rage. He'd accuse her of cheating, even if they weren't technically together. He'd bring up rumors, confront her about who she was texting, make threats, or go silent using distance as a form of punishment. One of the more revealing moments came when she described Diddy accusing her of having something with Chris Brown, all because they were seen dancing near each other at a club. Cassie denied anything happened. There's no evidence it did. But to Diddy, the image alone was enough to trigger jealousy. Prosecutors say this wasn't just insecurity, it was control. They argued that Diddy could be with anyone he wanted, but Cassie, she was his property. The minute she stepped outside that box, even emotionally, the punishment followed. The defense, meanwhile, used it to imply something else, that Cassie wasn't trapped. She was making choices, seeing people, living her life. And if Diddy was such a monster, why did she keep going back? That question hovered in the air, but the answer, at least according to Cassie, had nothing to do with romance. It had everything to do with power. Because behind the headlines, behind the music, and behind every private conversation was a man who she says controlled the money, the schedule, the image, and the consequences. And as messy as their dynamic looked, Cassie insisted the emotional chaos wasn't the real issue. It was what happened when she tried to leave. On paper, it sounded like closure. After more than a decade of an on and off relationship, Cassie and Diddy agreed to meet for dinner. No entourage, no media, just the two of them. A final goodbye in Malibu. Cassie believed it was the end. They ate. They talked. They reflected. According to her, it was calm. She thought it marked a new beginning, not with him, but without him. Diddy dropped her off at home. She went inside, alone, or so she thought. What happened next, she told the court, was the turning point. She says Diddy came back, uninvited. He forced his way in. He threw her to the ground and assaulted her. She used a word that the prosecution would later repeat again and again, raped. And she described something chilling. She said, his eyes went black. This wasn't about a breakup anymore. This was about violence, violation, power. But what made this moment especially complicated and controversial was what happened after. Because the very next day, Cassie exchanged texts with Diddy. The tone was neutral, even warm, and not. Long after, she says they had sex again, consensually this time. The defense jumped on that. If someone did what she claimed the night before, why go back? Why talk to him? Why sleep with him? But prosecutors pushed back hard. They pointed to the patterns of abuse, how trauma bonds form, how victims of sexual violence often stay connected to their abusers out of fear, confusion, or deep emotional conditioning. And there was something else. During that same encounter, the one that followed the alleged assault, Cassie received a FaceTime call from Alex Fine, her trainer at the time, the man who would later become her husband. The timing felt surreal. Prosecutors said it showed just how disoriented she was, how deeply entangled she still was in Diddy's world, even as she tried to move on. The defense, though, said it revealed something else, that Cassie wasn't afraid, that she was managing multiple relationships, that this wasn't about trauma, it was about drama. But Cassie insisted she wasn't thinking clearly. She was trying to keep peace, to avoid retaliation, to survive emotionally, physically, and financially. And she says at this moment, that night in Malibu wasn't just the end of their relationship. It was the beginning of her decision to finally break away. But the story she was about to tell next would make that even harder. Because when she talked about the freak-offs, the courtroom stopped breathing. It's the word that keeps resurfacing in headlines, court filings, and whispered conversations. Freak-offs. But what did that actually mean? According to Cassie, it wasn't just a nickname or inside joke. It was a system, a ritual. And she says it was one of the darkest parts of her relationship with Diddy. She testified that these events, often organized in hotels with escort services or Diddy's personal contacts, could last anywhere from 24 hours to 4 full days. Some involved drugs, some involved multiple people. And almost all, she says, left her emotionally and physically wrecked. She told the court that her entire identity during those years revolved around preparing for, enduring, and recovering from freak-offs. That she wasn't working, wasn't making money. Her full-time role, in her words, was to please him. And the more she resisted, she said, the more pressure he applied. The prosecution argued this wasn't some consensual kink. This was coercion. Cassie said she often went along with it out of fear. Not just fear of Diddy's anger, but fear of losing everything. Her housing, her connections, her safety. And there was another layer. She testified that some of these encounters were recorded, not always with her knowledge. She recounted one moment where she noticed a man named Jonathan O.D. filming during a session. She says she told Diddy. He said he'd handle it. Months later, she learned that Jonathan O.D. had allegedly received $5 million from Diddy, supposedly in exchange for signing an NDA and staying silent. That's when the word blackmail entered the conversation. But the defense pushed back. They argued that Diddy wasn't blackmailing her, he was protecting her. That he paid to keep those tapes out of public circulation because he cared. Because he didn't want to destroy her reputation. Cassie rejected that completely. She told the court that Diddy wasn't protecting her. He was protecting himself, his brand, his empire, his ability to control the narrative. And in one of the most unsettling moments of the trial so far, Cassie said she felt like a sex worker. But not one who chose that life, one who was kept in it. She described infections, emotional breakdowns, panic attacks. She said she lived in a state of constant tension, waiting for the next freak-off, trying to get through it and collapsing from the emotional weight of it all. And yet throughout it all, she stayed. To the defense, that's proof that it wasn't coercion. It was choice. But to prosecutors, it's exactly what makes this a trafficking case. Because according to federal law, it only takes one act of coercion to qualify. And Cassie says there were dozens. The courtroom leaned in when the defense played the audio. It was Cassie's voice, unmistakably hers. And what she said wasn't gentle, emotional, or even nervous. It was aggressive, direct, threatening. She was talking to a man, someone who had apparently approached her during a club appearance in Atlantic City in 2018. According to her, he casually told her that he had seen one of her freak-off tapes. Her reaction was explosive. In the recording, Cassie is heard demanding to know how he saw the tape. She warns him not to speak about it again. And then in a moment that caught everyone off guard, she says, "I'm not the one who's gonna kill you, but I'll get someone who will." The courtroom fell silent. The defense pounced. This, they argued, was not the voice of a helpless victim. This was someone defending her turf. Someone threatening a man over secrets she didn't want exposed. But Cassie had an explanation. She told the court that she was overwhelmed with panic, that hearing someone talk so casually about the most humiliating, vulnerable parts of her life, it triggered something in her. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone, she said. She was scared. She felt exposed, and she lashed out. The prosecution echoed that. They didn't try to deny the threat, but they said it came from fear, not power. A woman being confronted in public about something she never wanted shared. But the tape raised bigger questions. Who did have those videos? Were they being circulated? Was Diddy involved in distributing them? Or as he claimed, was he paying to make sure no one ever saw them? This is where Jonathan O.D. came back into focus. Years earlier, he was arrested for unrelated charges and during police questioning, confessed to participating in Diddy's freak-offs. He claimed he had recordings, knew of NDAs, and even said Diddy had given him $5 million to keep quiet. Cassie testified that she believed this man was the source of the video the clubgoer mentioned. That she had told Diddy about Jonathan recording her during one of the encounters, and that soon after he disappeared from their lives, quietly and suddenly. So what was the recording in Atlantic City really about? To the defense, it was a sign Cassie was involved in a lifestyle she didn't want exposed, but wasn't forced into. To the prosecution, it was one more piece of the puzzle, a system of fear, secrecy, and control. And for the jury, it became another moment where nothing was as clear-cut as anyone hoped. Because behind every tape, every threat, and every dollar exchanged, there was one lingering question no one could yet answer. Who was protecting who? You don't pay someone $5 million for no reason. That was the unspoken message the prosecution wanted to leave hanging in the minds of the jury. According to Cassie, after she told Diddy that Jonathan O.D. had recorded one of the freak-offs, without her consent, things moved quickly but quietly. No confrontation, no lawsuit, just silence. Then came the rumors. She heard that Jonathan O.D. had signed a non-disclosure agreement, she heard he'd received money, and later it was confirmed $5 million just gone. The payment itself wasn't illegal. Diddy had the resources, but the context surrounding it, that's where things got interesting. Prosecutors say this was classic damage control. That Diddy, knowing there were explicit tapes out there that could expose not only Cassie but him, acted fast to erase the risk. And not because he was protecting her reputation, but because he was protecting his own. They argued that the payment was hush money, a quiet payoff to keep those videos from ever seeing the light of day. That the NDA wasn't just about privacy, it was about power, about silencing someone who might threaten the empire. But the defense had a different take. They admitted this payout happened. They didn't deny it, but their version of the story? Diddy found out someone had secretly recorded Cassie, and he was furious. He wanted to make sure the tapes never surfaced because he cared. Because despite their messy history, he still wanted to protect her. To support their point, they brought up moments where Diddy had stepped in to help Cassie, even after they split, helping her with security, sending money, staying in contact. The defense used all of it to suggest a man who, though flawed, still felt responsible, even loyal. But Cassie's version didn't budge. She said she never asked Diddy to pay anyone off. She didn't ask him to intervene. And when she found out Jonathan had signed an NDA and disappeared, she felt sick, like something had been taken from her again. Her voice, her truth. There was also the unspoken irony. If she had been the one to record him and tried to sell it, no amount of money would have stopped the lawsuit. But in this case, the tapes were real, the money moved, and no one talked. Except now. In court, and for the jury, the existence of that payment was another sign that maybe this wasn't just about a toxic relationship. Maybe it was about control, and what someone's willing to spend to keep that control intact. Some parts of Cassie's story weren't violent. They weren't about black eyes or lawsuits or NDAs. They were quieter, but no less disturbing because they were about control. Not the kind you see in headlines, the kind that builds slowly, the kind that makes someone feel like they no longer own their choices. Cassie described a pattern that prosecutors called emotional submission. It wasn't about begging or screaming. It was about being trained to behave a certain way, to keep Diddy calm, to keep the peace. One of the most striking examples came in the form of a text. It was short, just a few words. I've been turning out you on all day. To the defense, it sounded like flirting, willingness, a partner playing along. But Cassie explained that it was something else entirely. It was something she felt required to say. A way to reassure Diddy, to avoid tension, to stay on his good side. She said that over time these texts became like currency. The more she sent them, the safer she felt. Not safe from physical harm necessarily, but from emotional punishment. The cold shoulder, the guilt trips, the sudden eruptions, and then there were the freak-offs. According to Cassie, she wasn't always directly forced. Sometimes she went along with it, but she said she did so knowing that saying no could come at a cost. That she might lose her home, her financial stability, or access to the people around her who were on Diddy's payroll. She told the court that when she pushed back, Diddy would shift the blame, accusing her of being selfish, of ruining his mood, of not loving him enough. She said it made her doubt herself constantly. This wasn't the kind of coercion that leaves bruises. It was deeper. It was mental, emotional, invisible to the outside world, but powerful enough to keep her locked in for years. The defense argued that this was just relationship dysfunction. Two adults in a messy, volatile romance. Not a crime. They pointed to Cassie's lifestyle during that time. The travel, the clothes, the events. They suggested that she wasn't trapped. She had freedom, she had agency, and she chose to stay. But prosecutors pushed back hard. This wasn't about luxury. It was about fear. About what happens when someone has all the money, all the influence, and all the leverage, and you have none. Cassie said it best in one sentence. I thought if I didn't give him what he wanted, I'd lose everything. And that's what made it so hard to walk away. Because by then, it wasn't just a relationship, it was a system. Sometimes, a story becomes real the moment you see it with your own eyes. Until this point, much of Cassie's testimony relied on memory. Powerful, emotional, but still subjective. Then the prosecution brought in something different, a video. It was surveillance footage from a hotel hallway in 2016. The video, captured by a security camera, didn't have sound. It didn't need it. It showed Cassie walking down the hall, fast. Diddy followed behind her, faster. In the grainy footage, he grabs her. Then it happens. He throws her to the ground and kicks her. She gets back up, walks away. He keeps following. The jury watched without a word. It was one of the first undeniable pieces of physical evidence in a case that had, up to that point, been built on conflicting emotions and complicated relationships. The video didn't tell the whole story, but it told enough. Cassie had mentioned the incident before. Not in court, but in private depositions. She said she remembered the fear, the shock, and how quickly it happened. But now the public could see it. And once you see something like that, it's hard to unsee. But even here, the defense had a counterpoint. They acknowledged the video, but then pointed to what Cassie did afterward. Just days later, she was seen attending a movie premiere, smiling, hair and makeup done, appearing in public like nothing had happened. And that's what the defense wanted the jury to focus on. If the relationship was abusive, if she was terrified, why go to a red carpet event so soon after? Why smile for cameras? To some, it might have looked like a contradiction, but prosecutors were ready for that. They brought in expert testimony explaining how victims of abuse often do exactly that. Pretend nothing happened. Present a polished image to the world while quietly dealing with trauma behind closed doors. Cassie explained it in her own words. She didn't want questions. She didn't want to be seen as broken. And maybe, on some level, she wasn't ready to admit what was really happening to her. Not even to herself. So she put on the dress. She showed up. And she smiled. Because sometimes that's easier than the truth. But the video didn't go away. And in a courtroom full of opinions, that footage became one of the few things no one could argue with. At first, it just sounded like a break. Cassie told the court that in early 2019, she finally began the process of stepping away. Not just from Diddy, but from everything connected to him. The lifestyle, the trauma, the silence. That's when she checked into a treatment center. But what she revealed in court gave that decision a deeper meaning. It wasn't rehab for substance use. It wasn't even for depression. Cassie entered a trauma-focused therapy program. She was diagnosed with PTSD. Her sessions included EMDR, a form of therapy designed to help people process disturbing memories. She said she struggled with flashbacks, panic attacks, and periods of emotional numbness that made even basic tasks difficult. For her, the diagnosis was confirmation that what she had experienced wasn't just a messy breakup. It was trauma, deeply rooted and untreated for years. But the defense saw it differently. They questioned the nature of her rehab, asked if it was really about trauma or about sex. Was this a form of treatment for love addiction, sex addiction, something else entirely? Cassie denied it outright. She said she was never diagnosed with those conditions. And while she admitted to being in a cycle of emotional dependency, she insisted it wasn't the same thing. Still, the insinuation lingered. The defense's unspoken point was this. If Cassie needed rehab, maybe the issue wasn't Diddy. Maybe it was her. Maybe she had patterns, choices that led her into these situations again and again. Prosecutors fired back. They argued that's exactly what makes coercion so hard to prosecute. Victims are often painted as unstable, broken, or complicit, but the reality, they said, is that trauma doesn't always look how people expect. It doesn't always come with visible scars. Sometimes it just shows up in silence, in bad decisions, in staying too long with the wrong person because you forgot what normal feels like. Cassie told the court that therapy was the first time she felt like she could breathe, that for years she was just reacting to moods, to threats, to pressure. She said she lost herself completely in that relationship. Rehab for her was about remembering who she was before all of it. And as her time in treatment came to light, something else surfaced. A video of Diddy at a spiritual retreat in Arizona, supposedly reflecting on his life and finding God. It was meant to humanize him, but when prosecutors showed the footage in court, Judge Subramanian reportedly looked unimpressed because in the middle of a federal trial, spiritual rebranding only goes so far. While Cassie was in trauma rehab, Diddy was in Arizona. At first glance, it sounded like a coincidence, two people trying to reset separately. But in court, the timing raised questions, and so did the setting. According to reports and court documents, Diddy checked into a high-end wellness retreat in Sedona, the kind of place known for yoga, meditation, and expensive views. But what was less clear was why he went. Was it rehab? A mental health break? A public relations move? Or all of the above? Prosecutors weren't subtle in how they framed it. They showed the court a video Diddy recorded while at the retreat. In it, he's wearing a hoodie, sitting in a scenic desert. Backdrop, and talking directly to the camera, he reflects on mistakes, regrets, and the need to reconnect with himself and God. The video was polished, thoughtful, emotional, maybe too emotional. Prosecutors argued that it wasn't a real moment of accountability. It was a branding move. That Diddy, fully aware of the growing legal pressure and media scrutiny, had gone to Arizona not to heal, but to control the narrative before it turned on him. They called it preemptive damage control, but the defense saw it differently. They said it showed a man under pressure, someone willing to look inward, to admit flaws, to grow. They pointed to the fact that Diddy had never been arrested at that point, that he wasn't responding to a crisis, but trying to get ahead of one. And maybe that was true, but what gave prosecutors leverage wasn't just the video, it was the contrast. While Cassie was quietly working through years of trauma in private, Diddy was filming desert monologues about spiritual growth. While she was in therapy for PTSD, he was talking about gratitude over smoothies. The judge wasn't moved. When the video was played in court, Judge Subramanian reportedly showed no reaction, no praise, no interest, just another piece of evidence to sort through. Because in federal court, redemption videos don't carry much weight, especially not when they're being measured against testimony, surveillance footage, and years of sealed settlements. So while Arizona may have been peaceful, it didn't soften what was coming next. Because if Diddy was hoping to control the story he was about to learn, the courtroom doesn't care about optics. It cares about what you did and who paid the price. A civil settlement doesn't always mean guilt, but it almost always means something happened that someone doesn't want to talk about. That's what made this particular payout so important. In addition to the already public $20 million settlement Cassie reached with Diddy, it came out in court that she also received $10 million from Intercontinental Hotels Group, the parent company of the luxury hotel chain where multiple incidents allegedly took place. No trial, no testimony, just a massive check and a closed door. To the defense, this was ammunition. They argued it proved Cassie wasn't after justice. She was after money. That she was building a legal strategy to extract the maximum amount from everyone involved. First Diddy, now the hotel. They hinted that the settlements were coordinated, that this wasn't about trauma, it was about leverage, but the prosecution took a different view, and they were careful in how they explained it. They said this wasn't just about what Diddy did, it was about where he did it. According to Cassie's legal team, hotel staff often turned a blind eye to the comings and goings in Diddy's suites. Escorts, drugs, surveillance cameras, and Cassie herself walking in and out in emotional distress. Her lawyers argued that the hotel knew something wasn't right. Maybe not the full picture, but enough to ask questions. And they didn't. That's why the hotel paid. Not because they admitted wrongdoing, but because the optics and potential legal exposure were too risky. The prosecution used that to their advantage. They framed the hotel's payment as a signal that what happened behind those luxury doors was serious enough to make even a global corporation hand over 8 figures just to make it go away. And there was one more angle. They pointed out that most victims of intimate partner abuse don't get justice. No trial, no headlines, and certainly not $30 million in settlements. But Cassie, she didn't go to the media first. She went to court. And every time she told her story, someone, somewhere paid. The jury wasn't allowed to take that as proof of guilt. But they were allowed to consider the pattern, because while Diddy could afford to write those checks, he couldn't stop what came next. Witnesses, records, and a story that no longer belonged to him. The courtroom wasn't expecting her, but when Dawn, Richard took the stand, the energy shifted. Best known as a former member of Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, Dawn wasn't just a celebrity guest. She had been inside the inner circle, working closely with Diddy, touring with him, and spending years around the same people, the same energy, the same silences that now sit at the center of this case. She came with her own story. According to her testimony, she had witnessed Diddy throw a hot skillet at Cassie. It missed, but she says it wasn't a warning shot. It was rage. She said she watched Cassie freeze, not surprised, but accustomed. Like this wasn't new. Dawn spoke about the way Diddy moved in relationships. She didn't claim to see every incident Cassie described, but she painted a picture that mirrored what the jury had already been hearing. A man who operated through intimidation, mood swings, and absolute control. But her presence on the stand came with questions. Because Dawn Richard has her own lawsuit pending, a separate civil case alleging harassment and emotional abuse. The defense immediately pointed that out, suggesting her testimony was part of a larger plan, that she had something to gain, that her memories were convenient. Dawn didn't flinch. She said she hadn't planned to testify, that she was approached only after Cassie came forward, that watching Cassie speak publicly gave her the courage to finally tell what she had seen and lived through, even if it meant being accused of seeking attention. Prosecutors used her testimony to reinforce one key theme. Cassie wasn't alone, that other women with their own platforms and reputations to protect were saying similar things, not word for word, but emotionally consistent. Fear, anger, regret. The defense, on the other hand, treated Dawn's appearance as another example of opportunism. They reminded the jury that memory is flawed, that people in lawsuits have motives. That emotional testimony isn't the same as evidence. Still, her presence was powerful. Not because she cried, she didn't. Not because she had a shocking reveal, she didn't. But because she stood there, confident and calm, and said, I saw what I saw, and it wasn't okay. And sometimes, that's all it takes to shift a trial's momentum. By the time federal agents reached Diddy at the Park Hyatt in Manhattan, they weren't just following a hunch. They had a warrant, and they were looking for signs, not just of crimes committed, but of patterns. What they found raised eyebrows. The room was luxurious, polished floors, private suite, but scattered across it were items that told a very different story. Multiple large bottles of Astroglide, baby oil, condoms, a small duffel bag containing a prescription, bottle labeled Frank Black, a name no one could connect to any legal identity. Inside the bottle, pink powder lab tests would later show it was a blend of MDMA, cocaine, and possibly traces of GHB, a substance often associated with party culture, but also at times with coerced encounters. The color itself, pink, raised suspicion, as it matched Cassie's earlier description of the drugs used during some of the freak-offs. To the prosecution, this was more than incriminating. It was the setup. The exact kind of hotel scene Cassie had been describing for weeks, drug-laced, prepped for sex, and disconnected from everyday logic. And then there was the timing. Diddy had agreed to turn himself in. This wasn't a surprise arrest. But according to investigators, the state of the room suggested something else, that Diddy might have been planning one last private event before surrendering. That claim was not proven, but it echoed a pattern the jury was already starting to recognize. A man with enough wealth and control to orchestrate nearly anything, down to the final hour. The defense responded quickly. They called it misleading theater. They argued that the items in the room weren't illegal and that the drugs, if they were even his, didn't prove coercion, trafficking, or abuse. They emphasized that no one else was present, that Diddy was alone, and that preparations in a hotel room don't amount to criminal behavior. But it was hard to shake the imagery, because even if the jury believed Diddy wasn't actively committing a crime at that moment, the room itself told a story, one that mirrored everything Cassie had described, from the baby oil to the aliases. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was the kind of detail that sticks in people's minds, especially when it matches testimony. Item for item. At first, it might have seemed unusual. Why would Homeland Security, an agency known more for border control, anti-terror efforts, be involved in a case centered around a celebrity and his ex-girlfriend? But once Agent Joseph Benda took the stand, things became much clearer. Benda works with a special Homeland Security task force focused on human trafficking. Not just smuggling across borders, but domestic cases too. ones involving manipulation, control, and commercial exploitation behind closed doors. His testimony was methodical, even clinical. No theatrics, just facts. He detailed the investigation. Timeline, how his unit had been tracking Diddy's movements and connections for months. How Cassie's lawsuit wasn't the first red flag, but rather the most public piece of a puzzle they'd already been trying to complete. And then came the arrest. Bender described the morning Diddy was taken into custody at a Park Hyatt. The agent said they approached the hotel with a warrant and entered peacefully. No struggle, no resistance. But what they found were the same pink powder, the baby oil, the aliases, lined up almost too well with what multiple witnesses had been describing. To the prosecution, this wasn't just validation, it was confirmation that this wasn't about jealousy or heartbreak or blurred relationship boundaries. It was about a system, one designed to isolate, manipulate, and exploit under the surface of fame. The defense, of course, saw it differently. They framed the Homeland Security presence as overreach. That agents were looking for a high-profile target to make an example out of. That the narrative of trafficking was being stretched to fit something that, at its core, was just a broken relationship between two adults. But Agent Bender didn't give them much to work with. He spoke plainly, professionally, and he never once veered into speculation. Instead, he stuck to the facts, the names on hotel logs, the patterns of payments, the videos recovered, the fear expressed by witnesses in private interviews, some of whom still hadn't testified publicly. His presence brought something new to the trial. Wait, because now it wasn't just about Cassie's story, or even the stories of other women. It was about a federal agency that had been watching for a long time and had finally decided they had enough. And when Homeland Security decides to show up, it usually means they're not leaving without a case. As the case picked up momentum, observers started noticing a familiar face among Diddy's defense attorneys, Brian Steele. If that name rings a bell, it's because he's been making headlines for months as the lead attorney for Young Thug, another high-profile artist facing a massive legal battle under Georgia's RICO laws. Steele is known for being relentless, strategic, and unflinching under pressure. Now he's part of Diddy's team. That move wasn't random, it was tactical. Steele brings experience from cases involving federal surveillance, witness cooperation, and complex criminal structures. And while Young Thug's situation is different, the mechanics are similar. The government trying to connect behavior, lifestyle, and influence to build something much bigger than a single incident. Diddy's legal team isn't just big, it's layered. Some handle the public strategy, others the courtroom defense. But Steele's presence signaled something deeper, that Diddy was preparing not just for this trial, but for a longer war. It also created a ripple effect across both cases. Because as soon as Steele joined Diddy's team, people started looking for crossovers. Were there shared witnesses, shared investigators, any indication that the federal government was linking larger themes of celebrity culture, music industry, power, and organized behavior? So far, no direct connection has been confirmed between the cases. But the overlap in legal personnel shows how seriously Diddy is treating this. He's not building a defense around denial. He's building one around strategy, pushing on timelines, questioning the use of evidence, and trying to undermine the emotional weight of the prosecution's case with technicalities and precision. And that strategy is already showing up in court. From motions filed at 3 a.m. to objections over exhibit formatting, Diddy's lawyers are working overtime to slow things down, catch the government slip in, or at least create enough procedural drama to cast doubt on the process. But it's a risky game, because the same courtroom where they're trying to outmaneuver, the system is the one hearing Cassie's story and watching other women start to speak up. And in a case where the emotional and legal stakes are already tangled, bringing in the nation's most recognizable RICO attorney sends a very clear message. Diddy's not just defending himself, he's gearing up for a fight that might go well beyond this one trial. It started as background noise in a testimony, small references, offhand mentions. But as the trial unfolded, celebrity names began surfacing more frequently. And not just any names. Nicki Minaj, Lauren London, Young Thug. At first, it wasn't clear what role, if any, they played. These weren't people directly involved in the allegations. They weren't being accused of anything. But their presence in the story added weight, context, and maybe, in some cases, pressure. Cassie testified that during particularly strained moments with Diddy, she attempted to reach out to him through mutual connections, people he respected, people she hoped might help calm him down. Nicki Minaj and Lauren London were among them. Did she actually speak to them? That's unclear. There's no public confirmation that contact was made, or that either woman was aware of the deeper dynamics between Cassie and Diddy, but their names were mentioned enough in court to raise eyebrows. Not because they were involved, but because they helped paint a picture of just how wide Diddy's influence extended, and how isolated Cassie felt, even within elite circles. Then there was Young Thug. His name came up for a different reason. Not through Cassie, but through Brian Still, the high-profile attorney representing both artists. The connection wasn't about friendship, but legal proximity. A subtle reminder that some of the same lawyers representing stars in one explosive trial were now helping Diddy navigate his own. It added a strange energy to the case, because when celebrity names get pulled into courtroom narratives, even as side notes, it sends a signal. This isn't just a private matter. It's cultural, it's connected, and it's happening in a world where image often matters more than truth. Still, prosecutors were careful. They never accused any of the celebrities mentioned of wrongdoing. They didn't suggest they witnessed anything, or even knew what was happening behind closed doors. But by bringing them up, they underscored just how public and yet hidden Diddy and Cassie's relationship truly was. Fame doesn't always protect people. Sometimes it isolates them further. And as these names echoed through the courtroom, the message was subtle but clear. In the world Cassie was living in, everyone was watching, but no one stepped in. From the start, Diddy's defense team came in, prepared to fight. They had experience, big names, and a detailed plan. But as the trial pushed deeper, cracks started to show. It wasn't one big moment. It was the accumulation of smaller ones, late-night filings, confusing exhibits, motions submitted hours before court resumed. At one point, over 400 documents were filed at 3 a.m., forcing the prosecution and the judge to scramble just to keep up. Judge Subramanian didn't hide his frustration. He called out the defense more than once, reminding them that volume isn't strategy. At one point, he warned that excessive filings with little relevance could backfire, not just legally, but in the eyes of the jury. Because what looks like over-preparation to a legal team might look like chaos to 12 people who are trying to follow a complex case day by day. Then came the objections. Constant, sometimes unclear, sometimes emotional. The kind of courtroom energy that suggests not just intensity, but instability. It's a shift that didn't go unnoticed. Legal analysts watching the trial noted that the defense, once sharp and composed, had started to play defense in the most literal way, reacting to testimony, scrambling over evidence, trying to discredit witnesses not through facts but through tone. Some observers said the strategy felt less like control and more like containment. But this wasn't just about style, it was about impact, because the jury doesn't just watch what's said, they watch how it's said. And if the defense appears frantic, disorganized, or overly aggressive, it risks undermining their core message that this case is about exaggeration, not evidence. And as the prosecution moved forward with calm, steady pressure, the contrast became even sharper. Still, the defense has one clear goal: to introduce just enough doubt, to make the jury question Cassie's version of events, to suggest that whatever happened between them was messy, yes, but not criminal. But every time they scramble, they reinforce another narrative, that this case isn't under control, and maybe neither is Diddy. Trials are about stories, but verdicts are about patterns. And by now, the jury has seen a lot. They've heard Cassie recount years of emotional manipulation, sexual coercion, and physical violence. They've watched a hotel video of Diddy throwing her to the ground. They've read her texts, some flirtatious, some fearful. They've listened to a threat she made on tape. And they've seen the baby oil, the aliases, the pink powder in a hotel room just days before his arrest. They've also heard the defense argue that this wasn't a crime. It was a dysfunctional relationship. Two adults making bad decisions. Jealousy, control, pain, but not trafficking. And in a way, they're right. This case isn't clean. Cassie's testimony isn't flawless. Her choices to stay, to return, to reconnect may raise questions for some jurors. The same goes for the settlements the continued communication, even the FaceTime call from the man who later became her husband. But here's what the law says and what prosecutors keep repeating. It only takes one act of coercion, one moment where consent wasn't real, one time when someone said no and was ignored, manipulated, or threatened into silence, and Cassie says there were dozens. The jury isn't being asked to decide if Diddy was a bad boyfriend or if Cassie made perfect decisions. They're being asked to determine if, at any point, he used power, money, fear, or force to get what he wanted from someone who didn't truly have a choice. That's the threshold. And beyond Cassie, they've heard from a federal agent who investigated him for trafficking, from a former group member who says she saw a hot skillet nearly thrown, from court documents detailing massive payouts to make claims go away. It's a lot to absorb. But that's exactly what federal prosecutors count on, because unlike a civil case where image and reputation drive the headlines, this one is about control, not media control, not brand control, but control over another person. And in that sense, the jury isn't just watching a trial, they're being asked to untangle years of silence and decide whether this time the silence finally breaks, no matter where you stand. On this case, whether you see Cassie as a survivor or a former partner with regrets, whether you see Diddy as a manipulator or a man caught in a storm of old choices, one thing is clear, this isn't over, because Cassie was just the beginning. More witnesses are lined up, some public, some behind closed doors. More documents are being unsealed. More settlements and private messages are likely to surface. And behind every legal motion, there's still a federal task force watching, connecting dots that haven't been made public yet. This trial has already forced the entertainment world to pause. It's pulled names into the spotlight that weren't meant to be there. It's raised questions about power, privacy, trauma, and the thin line between love and control when someone has everything: money, status, influence, and the other person has no way out. But beyond the headlines, there's something quieter at play, a shift in how we talk about abuse, in what counts as coercion, in who gets to be believed, even when the story is messy, uncomfortable, or doesn't follow the script, because real life never does. And when the jury finally delivers its verdict, it won't just be about Sean Combs. It will be about how seriously we take the stories that don't fit neatly into hero or villain. The ones that sound confusing, contradictory, but still carry truth. Until then, all we know is this: a man once considered untouchable is now on trial. And no matter how powerful his legacy was, this is the chapter that could define how it ends.